Dino heads, welcome back to another episode of the Dino Podcast. We're back from a short holiday hiatus. I'm fresh off a surfing trip in Mexico, and I hope all of you had a restful break and got to spend some quality time with your families. Now I feel refreshed and I'm excited to return to the pod, and we're starting 2025 with an episode on geopolitics. Specifically, we'll be discussing the strategic position of the West on the geopolitical stage. And in that episode, I'd like to explore two big questions. First, is the US-led West in a strategic decline? And second, how well are the political elites in the West managing our strategic position? To help discuss this topic, we're bringing on a geopolitical commentator that I followed for a long time and whose worldview I deeply respect, and a return guest, a friend of the show, Arnaud Bertrand. As a quick intro, in his career, Arnaud has had several acts. He's been a successful entrepreneur. He founded and sold the home booking platform HouseTrip, and he currently runs an Eastern medicine e-commerce platform, Me and Chi. And he's also found a second calling in life as a geopolitical analyst and commentator on Twitter X. I think, honestly, one of the most thoughtful and incisive commentators on world affairs on that platform, and someone from whom I learned a lot. So Arnaud, welcome back to the Dino Podcast. I'm very excited to get to do this a second time with you.
Thank you, Dino. Thank you for inviting me back. I'm really glad to be with you again.
The pleasure is all mine. And Arnaud, we'll dive into the first question in 1 second, but just one quick housekeeping note as we start. Listeners, if you enjoyed this discussion on world affairs, be sure to check out the bonus episode on Patreon, where Arnaud and I will dive deeper into Europe's strategic position specifically, especially how it's caught in this bloc politics conflict between the United States and China. And becoming a member on Patreon gets you access to bonus content like this. It supports the show, and you can find the link in the Spotify show page. And lastly, the other simple ways you can support the show, three big things. Follow us on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcast. Rate the show, hopefully 5 stars. And share the episode with a friend you think might enjoy it. That's always a huge help. But with that housekeeping out of the way, let's dive into the discussion. Thank you for tuning into the Dino Podcast. If you're enjoying this episode and generally like the conversations we have on the show, please consider supporting our Patreon today. Your membership on Patreon is a tip and a thank you to the creators that work hard on the show. It also comes with exclusive member benefits such as access to bonus episodes and exclusive content available only on Patreon. Consider becoming a member today. It costs less than one fancy cup of coffee in New York per month, and signing up is easy. You can find the Patreon link right in our Spotify show page, or simply search the Dino Podcast on patreon.com. I appreciate you listening and really love the community behind the podcast. Consider supporting the show and become a Dino head on Patreon today. Arnaud, I want to start by exploring this idea that's often commentated on about the West's strategic decline. How has our strategic standing changed over the last 20 to 30 years? And it's specifically on more concrete dimensions such as economic power, technology, and military might, the ability to project force abroad in an unrivaled way against our peer competitors. What's changed over the last 20 to 30 years?
I mean, the biggest thing that has changed is the rise of China, of course, and more generally, the rise of the global south. So it's not only China, but India at this stage is already the world's, I think they're the fourth biggest economy. And if you look at GDP, PPP, power parity, which is the correct way to measure economic might between countries, is the way that the CIA looks at economies. It's the way the IMF does. Most big institutions. China is already considerably larger. China's economy is already considerably larger than the US. I don't have the exact numbers in mind, but as far as I remember, it was something like 10-20% larger, which is already quite something. And generally, the G7, so the seven sort of biggest Western countries, are today smaller, have a smaller economy than the BRICS, especially when you take into account the what they call now the BRICS Plus, which makes up not only the original 5 countries, but now you have other massive countries on top, such as recently you had Indonesia announcing that they will join. It's a country that's projected to be, I think, the 4th largest economy by 2050. So, yeah, that's really the big story that's been happening for the past decades, you really saw. At the end of the Second World War, the US was the one big industrial power out there.
Right.
They were, you guys were really the factory of the world at the time. After being the so-called arsenal of democracy during the Second World War. And now that position is, no one would contest that. It's China, right? That is the big industrial power there. It's the first trading partner of almost all countries around the world. So that really changes a lot of things. So that's economy. Then you have military might. The US is still by far the largest military out there. It has the largest military budget. But actually,
it seems like our preferred way of engaging with the rest of the world.
Yes,
the military.
Yes, exactly. And I think that actually it's to the US's detriment more and more, because you're spending so much on this that you're doing it at the expense of other things. Like your own infrastructure, for instance, and so on and so forth, which is clearly not good. And I think more and more Americans are starting to realize that they're seeing China come up with all those massive infrastructure projects, high-speed trains and so on. Whereas you have a new base here and there, and it's like, how does that help us concretely, right?
Right.
So you're on top militarily, but how good is that exactly? And also you're doing, in a way, you're protecting with the military. You're protecting some of what we could call commons. Like shipping route and so on, which as you're becoming less of an industrial power, less important in trade yourself, it's like you're protecting something that is becoming less important for your own economy, and actually might serve China more than it serves you, ironically. That's the military. And then diplomacy, diplomatic power. I would rate it as pretty much on par right now with China, because in terms of actual diplomatic relations, I think China at this stage has more embassies, more diplomatic posts than the US does. I mean, for one, it has relationships with countries you don't have relationships with, right? And more and more, what we're seeing is sort of a divide between the West and the rest in that regard, especially since Gaza. For instance, where I'm based right now, I'm in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, in Asian countries. There is clearly a huge vibe shift in China's favor, especially in Muslim majority countries like Malaysia or Indonesia or Brunei, where they ran some polls before the war in Gaza. The population was divided about 50-50 between China and the US in terms of favorability. Now we're at something like 70-30. So it's a clear vibe shift. I think many people have realized a bit too late, if you ask me, how hypocritical the US was, and how the world order that the rules-based order that the US was claiming to defend, basically the only rule was we do what we want. There are no rules. If it is in the West's interest, or if it is in the interest of Western adjacent countries like Israel, then rules can be broken in the most egregious way.
Right. And something I saw in the news recently that was striking was John Mearsheimer, another foreign affairs commentator that I follow a lot, said something to the effect of, I think outside the West, almost everyone thinks that the United States and the Europeans are morally bankrupt. And we do see that big vibe shift that you're right. I think like there were episodes of hypocrisy throughout American foreign policy history that are reasons to be skeptical of our professed values underpinning the international order we lead. But the most recent one with the blank check support for Israel's war on Gaza has just been so egregious, so hard to ignore, that even people who are gullible, I think can see it for what it is in the global South. But let's actually turn to that aspect of world leadership. So we covered our economic position declining relative to China and the global South. Militarily, we're still able to project force abroad more than any other power. And it seems like China chooses to engage with the rest of the world more through economic projects and diplomacy than the military approach that we take in the United States. On the topic of moral authority and the more intangible side of leadership, what are the values and norms that we are taught underpin the Western-led global order since World War II? What should be universal values that is based on? What's the official story?
There is the theory, and then there is the practice. I mean, the theory is simple. It should be the what's written in the UN Charter. Basically, that is the basis of the post-World War II order. It is the list of behaviors and principles that the winners of World War II agreed upon. That would underpin the new global order. But when you look at those principles, they are violated on a daily basis right now. So let me give you an example. I mean, obviously, a very important principle is that countries should not be annexed or should not see some of their territory being annexed without, or there should be no aggression against sovereign countries without an agreement of the UN Security Council. And that's been, violated so many times, mostly by the US. I mean, the Iraq War, what happened with respect to Serbia in the 1990s. And of course, what's happening right now when it comes to Gaza and on Syria, and so on and so forth. So yeah, it's pretty clear that the US has stopped respecting that for a while. Another key principle is non-interference in other states' internal affairs, and that's even more egregious because the US has entire agencies whose entire purpose is to interfere in other states' internal affairs. So take the NED, for instance, National Endowment for Democracy, which is an institution that funds projects, NGOs in other countries in order to promote democracy, but in effect promotes, tries to shape the internal politics of those countries in favor of American interest. That's absolutely forbidden by the UN Charter, and that agency has existed for decades, and they violate that on a daily basis. I mean, we can do the whole list of the UN Charter. It's actually quite sad to see, and quite ironical, paradoxical to see that that's what we agreed on, and I think those principles are very good actually. They're sound, they make sense, they're still relevant today, but they've been undermined so much that they've become largely irrelevant. And interestingly, what China is saying, and that's another paradox, it's that they want, we keep saying that they want a new world order, when in fact what they're saying is, no, we actually want the order that we signed on at the end of World War II, and we don't want anything different than that. And China has always been very strict on non-interference, for instance. Like that is the one thing that when you hear any Chinese diplomat speaking, they will always come back to that non-interference in other countries' internal affairs, because they absolutely hate that the US does that so much when it comes to China, with all those things related to human rights and stuff like that. China, they've really applied themselves when it comes to other countries. They don't have any equivalent of the National Endowment for Democracy or stuff like that. Like they're happy to leave countries with their own system. They're not trying to make other countries become socialist with Chinese characteristics. Like they're happy to deal with anyone. And if they're unfriendly with China, they will, even cut relationships, or they can, do hostile actions such as sanctions, like we saw with, like we're seeing right now with the US. There are sanctions back and forth, but they're not trying to shape the politics of the US internally, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, it absolutely does. And for me, a formative experience in my worldview, and I guess like skepticism of the official U.S. narrative, was always the invasion of Iraq. I'd always been taught in school that, like, one, to appreciate international law and democracy, and two, that the U.S. is the leader of the democratic world, that protecting these norms in the world is like the animating force of our foreign policy. As you said, that's always been a bit of a lie. When we had a vested interest that would run contrary to those norms, we would cast the norms aside and all the niceties about liberty and international law aside. But it still seemed like through the 90s and early 2000s, there was some pretense of a fair system based on values there. And I feel that this served Western interests over the long term. Now the hypocrisy has just been piling up so much, and it's become so glaring that I think like that pretense is difficult to maintain, even for the least informed, the most gullible. As we noted a couple minutes ago, the blank check support that the United States and Western Europe offer for Israel's assault on Gaza, which the ICJ and really all the leading humanitarian organizations in the world have found to be a plausible genocide. That I think the whole world sees that for what it is. Also, we are shutting down certain individual liberties like free speech and the right to protest at home, the campus protests in service of some of these war or imperial projects abroad. I think like the undermining those professed norms is very visible, and there are kind of like assaults on democracy throughout the West. So as much as it was always a bit of a ruse,
yeah.
I feel like it's getting worse.
Yes, and when you think about it logically, it should be the inverse. Actually, Bill Clinton, of all people, said something smart once about this. After he was president, he said something to the effect of, if we are sure of staying number one forever, then we don't care about the rules, because we're gonna stay number one forever. We can do whatever we want. But if we can conceive of a world where we're gonna be number two, then it is in our interest to have some rules out there that all countries we respect, including the future number one, right? So it would be much more logical than when the US was at the peak of its power, at a time where it could not conceive of ever becoming number two. Then it could behave, somewhat erratically, like it very much did, but as its power gets more and more contested, then it is more in the U.S. interest to make sure that there are some rules of the game out there, and its adversaries or its rivals, that its rivals should also respect. But we're seeing almost the opposite of that. As its power gets more and more contested, then it violates more and more rules, up to a stage where there are basically no rules anymore. So
we're like a toddler that's kicking, screaming, scratching. Yeah, like we are going down kicking and screaming, unfortunately, as our power gets more contested. What do you think is the end result of this undermining of the international system that we set up in the ashes of World War II? As there's more geopolitical competition, we're undermining the system where it's expedient. The hypocrisy has become so glaring. Like, where does this leave us as geopolitical competition heats up?
That's very hard to predict. It's a good question. I think that at the end of the day, the world really dislikes chaos, and especially smaller, less powerful nations, they really want rules because they can't afford to live in a jungle, right? The jungle might be okay when you're on top of the food chain, like when you're a tiger or something like that. But when you're like a mice or a mouse or a small animal, then the jungle is a really scary place for you, and so you want rules that the tigers out there can respect. So I think that the BRICS and countries on the sort of Chinese side of the chessboard, they're putting in place a set of new, well, not new, but principles like around the UN Charter and so on, a new set of institutions and so on. And if we keep seeing this pattern of the US just acting completely erratically on the West in general, and then on the Chinese side of things, they're saying no, we're going to have those principles that we're going to make sure everyone respects and so on. Then it's quite fair to predict that that's going to be attractive to a lot of countries, and that's why I think you're seeing this migration towards the BRICS of more and more global South countries, and ultimately you might have the whole global South, which is basically the whole world except for the West, under this sort of alternative system. On the West being left, hanging in its sort of denial of reality and anger and so on and so forth. And then there is the question of Europe. I think Europe is in an especially bad place because it's clearly not a tiger. It's not even a great power, and so they also benefit. I mean, I am European. We also benefit from a world with rules, right? But Europe is strategically in a terrible position where it is defended by the US. Like it has no army of its own. There is virtually no European army, and it's dependent on the US for plenty of things, like even energy. Since the Ukraine war, it's paying an enormous share of its energy to the US, or technology. We depend on the US a lot for that and so on. That we are sort of dragged with this madness, with this American madness, and there is not much we can do about it, because if we complain and say no, we need to actually respect the UN Charter and so on and so forth, then the US can effectively apply a protection racket, basically saying, we're going to stop protecting you, or it will be a shame if something bad happened to you, or we're going to annex Greenland, like Trump is doing right now. So yeah, that's.
Or no, I love the analogy with Europe. It's not a tiger in the jungle. It's not quite a mouse, but maybe a dog, or like a domesticated dog, where it's not a wolf anymore. It's not ready for jungle life.
Yes, yes, that's a good one. Exactly.
I'll have to cut short this discussion of Europe. We'll come back to it in the Patreon bonus episode, and listeners, make sure to go check that out on Patreon, search for the Dino Podcast on Patreon, or check out the link in the Spotify show page. But Arnaud, coming back to the bloc politics that are emerging with the two sides of the chessboard, our side in the West, and then the Chinese-led global South on the other side. There seems to be a real noticeable shift in the perspective of policymakers in the U.S. from, I don't know, like the 90s, early 2000s, when everything was about globalization and the West was pushing for reduced barriers to trade and capital flows, connecting global markets, now to a world of fragmented blocks and us positioning ourselves against China, against other big geopolitical rivals. And it seems like we've moved away from the world of finding economic win-wins and agreeing on rules of the road for fair competition and trying to coexist peacefully, and are much more in a world where geopolitical competition supersedes everything else. In your view, which fields do you see this emergence of bloc politics and an opposition to China in particular most pronounced?
I mean, it's clearly the technology field, and specifically the most advanced technology, like semiconductors. So since October, was it 22? I think it was October 22. The US has put in place like export controls on semiconductors against China. Because the thinking, I think, is there aren't that many technologies for which the US is still clearly, well, at least the West or US allies and partners are still clearly on top versus China. Actually, an Australian strategic institute called ASPI, Australian Strategic Policy Institute, do a list of just this, like the most important technologies for the future, on where each country stands. And so they identified 64 such technologies, and out of the 64, China is already on top for 59, which is extraordinary.
Jeez.
Yeah.
Wow.
So that's kind of scary position for the US, and the US is on top for the other 5, one of which being semiconductors. And so it's kind of desperate move to be like, okay, we basically just have that. Those few technologies left where we are still clearly on top. Let's try to protect that at least, and at least deny China the ability to use our technology, which is sort of contradictory, because if you want to remain on top, you actually want the whole world to use your technology that generates more revenue for you, more budget for research and development, and so on and so forth. So I'm not sure I quite understand the move that the US is making there, because what they're saying is that we have the best semiconductors out there, and they do, clearly. So we will stop selling them to the biggest market by far on Earth, which is China, on the market that builds everything that needs semiconductors in it. And you're starting to see, big American firms like Intel really having, big financial issues, partly because of this, because they're seeing a lot of their revenue being cut because of this, and simultaneously China is like, okay, since we can't buy those the semiconductors from the US anymore. It's really important for us to double down on becoming on becoming as good as the US when it comes to semiconductors. So they're investing enormous amounts of money in that. And I'm speaking enormous amounts of money. I think it's in the trillions, literally, with tens of thousands of PhDs working on the topic. Like when China goes for something, it's like you really don't want them to do that. Basically, if you're the US, so yeah, that's the move that they chose to do. But I'm pretty sure that's gonna backfire. That's gonna backfire
Right.
big time. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting.
The latest move, was even worse. It was announced yesterday. At least the details of it were announced yesterday, which was that the US, they've now divided the world into 3 zones when it comes to semiconductors. So US allies and partners, only 18 countries. And then you have a second tier, which is sort of... then you have the rivals, like basically rivals or adversaries or enemies, like China, Russia, North Korea, Iran, and so on and so forth. And then you have the rest of the world. So rivals and enemies can't get anything, like any of the top chips. And then the rest of the world has actually pretty strict restrictions. And that's even shooting yourself in the foot even further if you're in the US, because now it's not only restrictions on selling semiconductors to China, but it's, if you count, there are 193 countries in the world. So now effectively you have restrictions on 175, because you have those 18 partners and allies who you can sell freely to, and 175 countries you can't sell freely to. And Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, announced that at the same time he said, we want American technology to basically dominate the world. But it's like if you wanted to dominate the world, like just sell it freely to the world. Like that makes no sense whatsoever. And of course, if you're in the shoe of rest of the world country, like say Singapore, for instance, Singapore is not part of the allies and partners. Strangely enough, you have some strange choices in there, because Singapore isn't, Portugal in Europe isn't, Switzerland isn't. Like if you're one of those countries, and you're like, and as China develops its own technology more and more, you're going to face a choice. You're going to be like, either I buy American technology, which comes with all those restrictions, and clearly they always change the rules, so you're probably going to have more restrictions, and then they're going to tell you, if you use my semiconductors, then you can't do business with China, and so on and so forth. So you have that choice. And it's very expensive. Typically, it's much more expensive than Chinese products, right? Or you have Chinese products which come with no restrictions whatsoever, and is much cheaper. And I can do business with the Americans. The Chinese have no problem with that. Like, which one am I going to choose? That's an obvious choice. So yeah, it's quite puzzling, to be honest.
This episode is brought to you by Little Saints, the mushroom-powered cocktails and spirits that you drink instead of alcohol. Do you like to consume nice beverages in social settings, but you're tired of alcohol ruining your weekends? The hangovers, the next day regret? Try Little Saints mushroom-based cocktails instead. They're powered by functional mushrooms like reishi and lion's mane, long used in Eastern medicine for their properties of calming the nervous system. No, they're not psychedelics, and no, they won't get you high. The Little Saints cocktails do give a light, euphoric buzz, a certain take the edge off feel that I find very nice in social settings. Plus, they're alcohol-free, sugar-free, and they have only 5 calories per serving. So unlike alcohol cocktails, Little Saints not only taste good, but it's good for you and your body. Try your favorite cocktail flavor today, including Negroni, Spicy Marg, and Paloma. You can order all of these on littlesaints.com. And best of all, you can save 20% by using the discount code Dino20. That's littlesaints.com, discount code Dino20 to save 20%. I'm very excited to partner with Little Saints. I'm a big fan of the product personally, and there's some very good people behind the brand, so you should order some today. Yeah, super interesting. So obviously it can hurt American businesses selling semiconductors.
Yeah.
It's super counterproductive strategically. It seems like a catalyst to literally kickstart China's own domestic production. And then you mentioned if you're not one of the 18 U.S. allies and partners, like how are you looking at this? Like,
Yeah.
aren't you like super incentivized to look for
Exactly.
alternatives to
Yeah.
U.S.?
And
What are the
on
grounds? What are the grounds for these restrictions that we at least profess? Shouldn't there be fair economic competition where, like, one, like these, we want these goods to be available broadly to the world, but then two, like, shouldn't we like compete in sectors of the economy with China and like may the best product win? Like, how do we justify this against the long time backdrop of globalization and professing support for free trade? What's the justification?
I mean, the justification is, as usual, it's always the same justification. It's national security, which can mean anything at the end of the day. So they're saying that those semiconductors are dual use, so they can be used in, missiles or airplanes, fighter planes, and so on and so forth. But obviously, that's completely bullshit. All military experts will tell you that that's actually the even for China, even if you don't have the exact technology, it's not difficult at all to either produce a small number of those extremely advanced semiconductors, like for your missile needs, for your military needs, or to manage to get your hands on some in the black market. That's okay. Like, you're always gonna manage to do that if it's for your military needs. The challenging thing is to have those at scale for consumer products, right? Like, if you want to build a phone with that, or computers, or massive data centers for AI applications, or stuff like that. And so clearly, that's what they're trying to prevent. China developing phones that are competing with the latest iPhones and so on and so forth, or China competing in AI as well, developing models, AI models, LLMs on the most advanced chips. So yeah, that's the reason that's being stated, but as we're seeing, it's not exactly working. I mean, Huawei is launching new phones that actually are becoming more popular than iPhones in China, because they're, from a user standpoint, they're just working just as well, and they have some features that the iPhone doesn't have, and they're cheaper. And even when it comes to AI and LLMs, China is releasing models. Like, more recently, they released one called DeepSeek V3. And when you look at benchmarks, those models are on par with the latest American models like ChatGPT or Llama or Claude or all of those. So yeah, it's not exactly working.
Yeah, and it seems like we're fighting to preserve some sort of technological advantage against China. But the more you look, the more you see China catching up in higher and higher tech sectors of the economy. It seems like initially they were the place for cheap labor, then they got really good at manufacturing, and then they got really good at, automated high-tech manufacturing. I think 10 years ago, I never would imagine that China would be the leading car exporter, which I believe it is right now. Just kind of burst onto that position. And we're seeing it more and more in tech hardware and AI. Some of our economic moves in the United States seem to have been counterproductive. I would also argue that our pursuit of military misadventures abroad and the drain on resources that entails is counterproductive for us as a global leader and for us as citizens of our society. But it kind of begs the question of how much of the strategic decline of the West relatively is inevitable versus how much is the result of poor leadership by our political class. So the rise of China, the twilight of the West's technological advantage, those seem like big forces of nature that are hard to stop. But I get the sense that we also impact the speed at which these trends unfold through policy. But what's your take on the question of inevitability versus the result of policy making?
I always look at the long history of the world, and if we look at the long history, it's always been the case that China and India, which are the biggest countries out there in terms of number of people, where for 1,800 out of the past 2,000 years were the most important economies out there. It makes sense. They are the biggest countries. They should be the most important economies. And then after the Industrial Revolution, which goes to show that it's really all about technology. Like economics is really all about technology. The West, first the British Empire, and then it rapidly spread to other Western countries. They had an unfair technological advantage that allowed them to produce on massive scales much faster and cheaper than other countries around the world, which meant that they could be vastly wealthier and more powerful than they ought to be, where you arrived at this insane situation where you had this small island country lost in a corner of Europe, managing to colonize half the planet. Like, if you think about it, that's crazy. And if you think about it, you can see that in history, that is an aberration. That should not. That's the aberration. The normal order of things, of course, is the bigger you are, the more people you are, the wealthier you are. The aberration is a small European country managing to have so much power over the rest of the world, and so now we're arriving back to a situation where, despite all the efforts by the US, you have the rest of the world and China, leading the pack, managing to catch up on being on par technologically with the West, and so bit by bit you're going to go back to a world the way it used to be, where the biggest countries out there, China and India, are going to be the biggest economies. It doesn't mean that the West is going to have to decline. It's the decline can only be relative, meaning you're not going to be bigger than China or India anymore. You're going to be smaller, but you can still grow and you can still, live in prosperity and keep your values and so on and so forth. Yeah.
I want to be number one though. I want to be top of the pack. Yeah.
That's the issue. And I think that wisdom would be to recognize that this is structural, this is unavoidable. Like sooner or later, China, India, the global south, they're going to catch up. You're not going to manage to hold that technology and that advance for forever. And so wisdom dictates that you make peace with that, and that you shape a world order with a set of principles that you're happy with. Simply saying, okay, we recognize that you guys are the biggest countries out there, so it's normal that you're wealthier than us, but let's make sure we live in a world with rules that we all agree to. But instead, the US, the West, is trying to prevent that world from arising, which is a fool's errand, I think. And in fact, quite a few strategic thinkers in the US say exactly that. And in doing so, they're shaping a much more hostile and chaotic new multipolar world than it ought to be, where it's going to be, extremely divided, and where, because of everything the US and the West does, there will be a lot of anger towards it. You don't want to be in a situation where 10, 20 years from now, China, India, and so on are the biggest, most powerful, wealthiest nations out there, and they're extremely angry at you, right? And that's sadly, bit by bit, what's the world that's shaping up to be. So I feel that's shooting yourself in the foot.
Yeah. So I think that just push to maintain primacy at all costs has major downsides on the international stage. You're absolutely right. It's creating a more hostile world. It's building ill will towards us. Yep. And that's not a good thing to do for when we are ultimately not in a position to dictate. What are the impacts at home when we think about prioritizing this international primacy above, say, the needs of citizens at home? It always seems like there's infinite money for Project Ukraine or Israel's wars in the Middle East, and there's very little resources available for citizens in the United States. How is that felt, and how do you see Western citizens perceiving the priorities of their political class?
I think there is a similar story that's happening in most of the Western countries. I think the US very much is leading the pack with the election and now the re-election of Trump. But you're seeing, quite similar stories shaping up in, my country, France, for instance, with, kind of Trump-like figures becoming more and more popular. Of course, Germany with the AfD, and the UK, and so on and so forth. And basically, the way I think Europeans are being sort of gaslighted on a massive scale. They're not being told what's really happening. What I was explaining to you that this new multipolar world is structural. The emergence of it is structural. That's going to happen. We're not going to be the biggest power out there anymore. America can't be number one.
I was always taught our values are better. We have democracy, others don't, and we will be number one forever as a result.
Exactly.
You're telling me that's not the case.
Exactly. That's what we're all being told. Not only Americans, but Europeans as well. And so, as a result, I think there is a lot of cognitive dissonance in public opinions in the West, where they're trying to explain the world as they understand it, and what they're seeing happen concretely in their lives. Like they're seeing that they're seeing the rise of China. They're seeing that a lot of countries out there don't buy into Western values. They're seeing the war in Ukraine and Russia likely winning against the collective might of NATO, which is quite something. And they're trying to. I think there is a lot of confusion out there. They're trying to make sense of it all. And that's always a very ripe moment in history for populism to rise. So figures like Trump with or Le Pen in France or the AfD and so on, with kind of easy explanations, but completely false most of the time. Going after scapegoats, telling them, it's all because of immigration, and if we get rid of foreigners, everything is gonna go good, and all those things. When at the end of the day, the truth is much more complicated than that, and there is no easy solution. And actually, I passionately believe, for instance, when it comes to immigration, I'm against mass immigration. I think it was historically a mistake in Europe. But I also think that once you have several ethnicity living in a given country, you should optimize for harmony between them and not fuel mutual hatred, which is what a lot of those politicians are doing. And the result of that is that you're going to have much more and more internal tensions between people in a country. And in the US, actually, a great illustration of that is the current LA fires. Where normally, in a healthy society, a crisis is a time of coming together as a society, as a country. We pull together in order to, collectively solve the crisis. The last time we saw that in the US was 9/11. I think the American people, all came together. I think that's undeniable. They all felt, collective sense of mourning, of sadness, and collective understanding of the threat that they faced. Well, after the response was, not the right one, that's for sure, because it led to the Iraq War and so on. But that's normally what you're seeing in a somewhat healthy society when you have a crisis. And what we're seeing instead right now with the LA fire is everyone competing to blame basically the other camp. So on the Republican side, on the right side, you have people blaming it all on DEI, and women leadership among firemen, and so on and so forth, among
They
the
were out shopping.
Democrats.
They were out shopping.
Yeah, basically
That
stuff like
particular
that.
day, they were on a shopping trip at Bloomingdale's. It's unfortunate.
Yeah.
I'm joking. I'm gonna get my podcast canceled. Parody, ladies and gentlemen, parody.
And then on the Democratic side, you have them blaming it on climate change denialism or billionaires buying water companies on stuff like that. But the end result is that everyone is blaming each other, and the fire is still burning, right? You have no sense of collectivity there, of Americans pulling together in order to solve this crisis. And in fact, when a crisis should improve social cohesion, in this instance, and in a lot of the crises that the US faces, it furthers the divide, which is the sign of a society that's that's non-existent anymore. Because what is a society? A society is a collectivity. People having a collective understanding of reality, of the challenges that they face, of them putting together in hard times and so on. We're not seeing that. So I think it is a sign that the collectivity American society is no more, because it is extremely fragmented.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think like that tearing of the fabric of society, that's very dangerous to like maintaining a sustainable country. And people are turning more to political alternatives, to populists, and not nice and cuddly left-wing populists like Bernie Sanders, but more demagogue right-wing populist. I tend to perceive that as, in many ways, a symptom of a failure in political leadership by the ruling class. That the people have some substantive grounds to be upset, that their needs are not being met economically. Everything they were told, if you work hard and study and save, you can own a home, you can get ahead economically, be better off than your parents. That's turning out not to be true. So I think the grounds for it is substantive, and there is blame to bear by the people who have held power in American and Western politics. But as you said, that makes them very ripe to demagoguery.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I completely agree with you. It's there are a lot of grounds to be angry, and political courage will be to simply tell the truth. The truth is not easy, right? And it's not going to be popular, most likely, because you need to tell people, look, we're going to be number 2, maybe even number 3. And we need to work harder. We have an enormous amount of debts that we're going to have a very hard time reimbursing. So you guys are going to suffer probably a significant loss in prosperity, but that's what we need to do if we want to pull through. Vote for me.
Who wants to hear that, Arnaud?
Yeah, exactly. So I mean, you have it right there. That's the issue. Whereas then you have someone like Trump who says, guys, it's all the fault of immigrants. They're stealing our job. They're doing whatever. If we deport them all, then everything is going to be solved, and we're going to annex Greenland and Canada, and we're going to be much bigger, much more powerful, and you will see we will do something amazing together. You're all going to get much richer and so on. Yeah, I'm voting for this guy.
Well, let's talk about the big boy, about Donald Trump. Are we going to be number 1 again now that he's coming back? No, but kidding aside, do you think that Donald Trump represents any sort of like substantive departure from the neoliberal order, or is it just kind of wishful thinking by the parts of his coalition that might be more anti-war, that might be more like anti-centers of power and in Washington, D.C., and that Trump is just going to do all sorts of wrong-headed policies that really have no substantive impact on our strategic position or the well-being of the citizens at home?
I think that the main difference between Trump and Democrats and probably other Republicans is that he really, really says the quiet parts out loud.
Yes.
So it's not that the way he acts is significantly different from the others, but he really says it in a way where you're like, whoa, I can't believe America is doing that, when it has always done those things, just always, sold them under the veneer of liberalism, when it was always more hard-nosed realpolitik, actually. So I think that's the big thing with Trump. On the best way you can see that is that most of his policies actually were actually kept by the Biden administration.
Right.
They kept saying that Trump is that horrible character who does nothing right, but then they kept everything. So yeah, that's the big thing. I don't think there will be that much substantial change. Like the biggest substantial change that he could make would be to really reduce American military footprint, and recognize that primacy on the U.S. being the world police and so on. That's over. That's something for an age that the U.S. is not going to go to anymore, and we'd better use that money at home to develop U.S. infrastructure and so on and so forth. But I really don't see any sign of this happening. And if anything, we're seeing the U.S. go back to an age of even more hubris, like back to the colonial 19th century with this rhetoric around annexing this or that country, that we haven't heard that type of language since the 19th century. So it's really strange, to be honest.
It is super strange. And I love what you said about Trump says the quiet part out loud. There's a scene in The Simpsons where Krusty the Clown, he's a movie critic, and he's bribed into voting for Mr. Burns's terrible movie. And Bart asks him, like, Krusty, how could you? And he says, let's just say it moved me to a bigger house. He's like, whoops, I said the loud part quiet and the quiet part loud. That's exactly what Trump does.
Exactly. Yeah.
He says the quiet part out loud. But do you see any areas where there might be reason to be hopeful that he might introduce positive changes? I confess I'm deeply skeptical after the experience of his first administration. But for example, one could say on the war front, he has kind of indicated that he's more open to reaching a negotiated settlement to the war in Ukraine. Do you put any credence in that type of rhetoric from him?
Yeah, I mean, I think he wants to. Clearly, I think he wants to reach a settlement in Ukraine. I think he genuinely. I mean, it's hard to say what he genuinely believes or not, but there were no big war in his first term. That's true, and I think he genuinely doesn't like war. He's more of a businessman. So I think he would genuinely want to stop the war in Ukraine. I'm highly skeptical that he will manage to do so, because it would involve agreeing to concessions with Putin that are going to be extremely hard for the US to make without very, very significant loss of face, basically. Basically admitting that the US, NATO lost big time, which will do considerable damage to US standing. But
We
he
lost
might do it.
to Russia, to their missiles made 30% out of washing machines. We lost to them.
Exactly. Yeah.
Talk about breaking cognitive dissonance,
Yeah. And that would be also a major shock in Europe, which might induce also a big vibe shift, which I would be happy with, but it wouldn't be so much in the US favor, because we might realize that we need to stop being vassals. I'm also so that's on the Ukraine front. On the Middle East front, I'm actually quite worried,
Sure.
because I'm hearing quite a lot of insane rhetoric when it comes to Iran from people around Trump. And Israel clearly wants that war, the war against Iran, and Iran is weakened somewhat with what happened to Lebanon and Syria, which were key allies. So Trump, together with Israel, might decide that strategically speaking, it's the right time to go to war with Iran, or he might be pushed into that, which obviously would be very bad. Yet another war in the Middle East. So yeah, let's see.
Yeah, I think he definitely has some people around him who are very dangerous on the Middle East front, and who want that war with Iran. It's a war that neoconservatives have been itching for a long time. There was that print that the neoconservatives had. What was it? 5 countries that they wanted to take out: Iraq, Lebanon, Syria, and it looks like Iran is next on deck. But that war would obviously be much more disastrous for the region and the world than some of these other conflicts. Like it's not a beaten down country like Iraq was at the time of the invasion in the early 2000s. It's a large country with like a robust military, robust ballistic missile technologies. That would be no walk in the park. It would be really, really ugly. Okay.
Scary when you look at that list, actually, Iran is the last one.
Exactly.
So it really makes you think, like, everyone. I think that list was revealed by Wesley Clark, the former, the general commander of NATO, if I'm not mistaken. Mm-hmm. When he revealed it at the time, he was like, even I thought that was completely crazy. And everyone at the time was like, thank God we didn't do that. We only did Iraq. But now we're at the stage where, it's only Iran left. And
that's right.
So it is, it's quite insane.
And from the neoconservative perspective, it seems like an opportune time to strike. Like on one hand, you have the twilight of your supremacy. So if you don't do it now, you might never be able to. And then on the other hand, I think like one of the big deterrents for Iran has always been that axis of allies from Syria to Lebanon and the militant group Hezbollah in Lebanon. Now that that's all completely weakened, it seems like an opportune moment. So I think like a very dangerous situation where war might be tempting for Trump and his team. Okay. Arnaud, as we round out the episode, and as we've talked about our approach in the West to world affairs, the push for primacy, our undermining of some of our own democratic and individual liberty values, the pushing of the world into competing blocks in the economic and technology spheres. As I talk about these topics, I always get the sense that it doesn't have to be this way, and a better approach is possible, one with more wisdom and a more of a long-term view towards how we live and coexist with others. In your view, what could such a better approach be, in terms of engaging with the world?
For the US, I think there is no topping the UN Charter. I would be extremely happy if, simply the UN Charter was respected, like no aggression to other country, respecting internal, no interfering in the internal affairs of other countries, and so on and so forth. This might sound like a pipe dream, unrealistic, but it's something that's the smartest people on the planet at the end of World War II, got together and decided was the only way, and decided that they as countries could sign up to that and abide by that. So I don't think that it's that unrealistic, because plenty of people clearly agreed that it was, and I can't see any alternative way forward to that. We can't keep doing these forever wars and spread all this death and misery on the world. We've got to be smarter than this as a species. So yeah, hopefully one day we'll manage to actually implement it.
Hopefully one day we'll learn and get that level of wisdom. I completely agree, Arnaud. Arnaud, I think we can leave the main discussion there. Thank you again for returning to the Dino Podcast. I have appreciated your geopolitical analysis for a long, long time. I was super thrilled to have you on the first time around, and I'm even happier to have you back on the show. You're truly, now as a repeat guest, only my second repeat guest, you truly are a friend of the show. Arnaud, thank you.
Thank you, Dino.